The Sumerian texts reveal a bloodline preserved after the Great Flood, not a metaphor, not symbolic language about renewal or fresh beginnings, a genealogy, names, father to son, king to heir, a chain of rulers whose reigns are recorded both before the waters rose and after they receded, as if the catastrophe was simply another entry in an administrative ledger. The well-Blundell prism sits in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, catalogue number WB444, four-sided, clay, perforated vertically through the centre where it once turned on a wooden spindle. The scribe who shaped it around 1800 pressed cuneiform signs into wet clay with methodical precision, column after column, naming kings and counting their years. The surface is cool to the touch. The weight is substantial. This is not decoration. This is documentation. And in the documentation, there is a problem. The prism lists 8 kings who ruled 5 cities before something the Sumerians called the Abzu, the Flood. Alulim of Eridu, who reigned 28,800 years. Alaujar, who followed, another 36,000 years. The numbers grow impossible, stretching into spans no human life could contain. Then the text arrives at a single sentence, stark and factual. Then the flood swept over, and immediately after the flood had swept over, and the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. The kingship descended, not invented, not begun, descended, as if it had been somewhere else, and returned. And then the list continues without pause, naming 23 kings of Kish, their reign lengths now drastically shorter, hundreds of years instead of tens of thousands, but recorded with the same administrative tone. Jushur, Kulasinabel, Nanjiklisma, on and on, father succeeding father, dynasty following dynasty, until one name appears that changes everything. Enmebaragesi, 22nd king of the first dynasty of Kish. In 1912, archaeologists excavating near Baghdad uncovered fragments of an alabaster vase. On the surface, in archaic cuneiform script dated to approximately 2900 BC, a simple inscription, Mebrajesi, king of Kish. The early form of Mebrajesi's name, pressed into stone by someone who lived when he ruled, not a legend recorded millennia later, not mythological embellishment, contemporary evidence. This is the first name from the post-flood section of the king list, confirmed by physical archaeology, which means that at some point the list transitions from mythology to history. But where? And if Enmebaragesi was real, what does that suggest about the names that came before him? What about his father, listed in the king list as Enmenbaragesi's predecessor? What about the kings of the dynasty before Kish? And most critically, what about the claim that all these post-flood rulers were successors to a lineage that survived the waters? The Sumerians did not present the flood as an ending. They presented it as a continuity problem that was solved. Kingship interrupted, then restored. A bloodline preserved through catastrophe and resumed on the other side. Wherever you are right now, in the quiet hours of your time zone, in the stillness before sleep, you're hearing something the ancient scribes wanted you to know, that their civilization remembered a rupture, and that they believed they were the heirs of what came before it. The question held in this clay prism, pressed into permanence nearly 4,000 years ago, is whether they were remembering history or inventing it, whether the flood was metaphor or memory, whether the genealogy they recorded so carefully, generation after generation, king after king, preserved in multiple copies across centuries, was a myth of legitimacy or an archive of survival. This is not a question the tablets answer directly, but they offer something else: details, procedures, patterns, names that repeat across independent sources, numbers that encode something the scribes thought important enough to preserve with precision, and a relentless insistence, document after document, that what came after the flood was connected by blood to what came before. The architecture of memory. The Sumerians did not appear suddenly in the archaeological record. They emerged gradually in the alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in a region with no stone, little timber, and a climate that could sustain neither large-scale agriculture nor permanent settlement without deliberate engineering. They built anyway canals, levees, irrigation systems that turned marshland into farmland, and cities. By the mid-4th millennium BC, Eridu stood at the edge of the marshes. Uruk rose nearby, growing into a sprawling urban centre with monumental temples and administrative complexes. Lagash, Nippur, Kish, each city developed its own political identity, its own patron deity, its own ruling dynasty. They shared a common language, a common writing system, and a common cosmology, but they were not unified. They competed for resources, for trade routes, for regional dominance. Kingship was local, contested, and temporary, which makes the king list strange. The Sumerian king list does not reflect political reality. It presents a sequence of dynasties ruling one after another, as if Mesopotamia was governed by a single continuous kingship that simply moved from city to city. First Eridu held it, then Bad Tabira, then Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, after the flood Kish, then Uruk, then as if kingship was a thing that could be possessed, transferred, inherited. This is not how early dynastic Mesopotamia functioned. Multiple city-states ruled simultaneously. Wars were frequent. Alliances shifted. To claim that the kingship was in Kish, when archaeological evidence shows that Uruk, and Lagash were also thriving centres of power, is to impose a fiction of unity onto a fragmented landscape. Unless the king list is not describing political reality, unless it is describing something else. A claim, a theology, a memory of how things were supposed to work, based on how the Sumerians believed things once had worked, long ago, before the world changed. The king list exists in multiple versions, inscribed on clay tablets and prisms across several centuries. The World Blundell prism, now in Oxford, is the most complete, but other copies survive. Tablet WB62, also at the Eshmolean, preserves the antediluvian section with slight variations. Fragments held by the University of Pennsylvania, the British Museum, and private collections add further details. No two manuscripts are identical, yet the structure remains consistent. Pre-flood kings with extraordinary reigns, the flood as a dividing line, post-flood kings with progressively shorter reigns. Cuneiform was not an alphabet, it was a syllabary, a system of wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay with a reed stylus. Each sign could represent a sound, a word, or an idea, depending on context. Learning to read and write cuneiform required years of training in scribal schools called edubas, where students copied texts repeatedly until the signs, the grammar, and the literary conventions became automatic. Scribes were specialists, often priests, operating within temple bureaucracies that managed grain distribution, land ownership, labour organisation, and ritual calendars. These were not people who recorded myth casually. Their work was administrative, legal, economic. They kept receipts. They recorded contracts. They tracked temple inventories and tribute payments. Their tablets were filed in archives, organised by content and date. When they inscribed the king list, they did so with the same methodical care they applied to grain accounts. They numbered the kings, they counted the years, they totalled the dynasties, they treated the information as data. Why would a bureaucratic document include 8 antediluvian kings with impossible reign lengths, followed by a flood, followed by a transition back to more plausible chronology? If the purpose was political propaganda, to legitimize current rulers by linking them to an ancient past, why include the flood at all? Why not simply claim unbroken descent from Alulim of Eridu without the interruption? The flood creates a problem. It breaks the continuity. It demands an explanation for how kingship resumed. And the text provides one. The kingship descended from heaven after the waters receded and was re-established in Kish, not created anew, not invented by survivors, re-established, resumed. This language suggests that the Sumerians understood kingship as something external to human invention, something that existed before the flood, and had to be restored after it. And if kingship needed to be restored, then someone had to survive to receive it. Someone had to carry the knowledge of what kingship was, how it functioned, what its rituals entailed. Someone had to preserve the bloodline that made a king legitimate. The Sumerians were obsessed with legitimacy. A king's authority depended on divine favour, demonstrated through military success, economic prosperity, and the construction of temples. But it also depended on genealogy. Son succeeded father. When a dynasty ended and a new one began, scribes took care to note the transition, often with explanations of how the gods transferred their favour. The king list's insistence on naming fathers and sons, generation after generation, reflects this concern. Lineage mattered, descent mattered, blood mattered, which raises the question, if the post-flood dynasties were real, and we know that at least some of them were, because Emma-Barazezi appears in archaeological inscriptions, then why would the scribes invent a connection to pre-flood kings? What purpose does it serve to claim that Jushur of Kish, the first post-flood ruler, was the heir to Ubaratutu of Shurpak, the last pre-flood king, unless the Sumerians genuinely believed that connection existed? They could have started the list after the flood. They could have said kingship began in Kish with Jushur, but they didn't. They included the antediluvian kings, preserved their names, recorded their cities, and embedded them into a continuous sequence that spans the flood, as if the flood was not an origin point, but a transition, as if what came after was the restoration of what came before. The clay tablets holding these texts are fragile. Over millennia, many have shattered. Some survive only as fragments, their edges broken, their columns incomplete. But enough remain to reconstruct the narrative. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, compiled by Oxford University scholars, synthesizes multiple manuscripts into a composite translation, noting where versions disagree, where names differ, where numbers vary. The consistency is remarkable. Across centuries, across scribal schools, across cities, the structure holds. 8 kings before the flood. Flood. Kingship descends. Kish. Uruk. Ur. This is not the invention of a single scribe. This is a tradition, maintained deliberately, copied and recopied by generations of scribes who believed the sequence mattered, who believed the names mattered, who believed the claim of continuity across the flood was worth preserving. And if they believed it, the question becomes, what were they preserving? Memory? Myth? A theological framework that explained their place in cosmic history? Or something stranger, an actual record passed down through oral tradition and eventually committed to writing, of a world that existed before their own, when the waters rose? The flood is not unique to the king list. It appears in multiple Sumerian texts, told from different perspectives, with different protagonists, but always with the same outcome. The gods decide to destroy humanity, one man is warned, he builds a vessel, he survives, and the world begins again. Tablet CBS 10673 sits in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, baked clay, 6 columns of text, 3 on each side, fragmentary. The tablet originally held approximately 260 lines. What survives is roughly the lower third. The text, written in Sumerian, is dated by script to the Old Babylonian period, around 1650 BC. It is called the Eridu Genesis, though the ancient Sumerians did not give it that name. Modern scholars assign the title because the text describes the creation of humanity, the establishment of cities, and the flood that interrupted early civilization. The preserved sections are fragmentary but revealing. The gods established cities under the protection of specific deities. Eridu belongs to Enki, god of water and wisdom. Bad Tibira is assigned to another deity, Larak to another, continuing the pattern. Then comes a gap, and when the text resumes, the gods are deliberating. They have decided to send a flood. The reasons are unclear in the damaged sections, but the decision is made. Enki opposes the decision. He does not confront the other gods openly. Instead, he goes to a reed wall in the city of Shuruppak and speaks to it, knowing that a man named Ziusudra stands on the other side, listening. The text reads, "Standing at its side, he said these words, 'Reed wall, listen to my words. Pay attention to my instructions. A flood will sweep over the cities, the land, to destroy the seed of humankind. This is the decision, the decree of the assembly of the gods.'" Ziusudra is described as a king, humble, obedient, attentive to divine instruction. He hears Enki's warning and responds. The next section of the tablet is broken, but when the text resumes, the flood has already begun. 7 days and 7 nights of storms. Then sunlight returns, and Ziusudra emerges from his vessel. He makes offerings to the gods, and an Enlil, the chief deities, arrive. They are angry that someone survived, but Enki persuades them, and they grant Ziusudra eternal life, settling him in Dilmun, a distant place described as a paradise. The text does not describe the construction of the vessel. It does not name Ziusudra's family. It does not explain how the animals were gathered. These details either existed in the damaged sections or were assumed knowledge, part of a larger tradition that the audience already knew. What the text emphasizes is Ziusudra's piety and Enki's intervention. The flood is the god's will. Survival is an act of divine mercy toward one deserving man. A different version of the story appears in the Atra-Hasis epic, an Akkadian text known from multiple copies, including fragments held by the British Museum. The protagonist's name changes. Ziusudra becomes Atra-Hasis, meaning exceedingly wise. But the structure is the same. Humanity grows numerous and noisy, disturbing the gods. Enlil, king of the gods, decides to reduce the population through plague, drought, and famine. When these measures fail, he decrees a flood. Enki warns Atra-Hasis by speaking to the wall of his reed house, instructing him to build a boat and seal it with bitumen. Atra-Hasis obeys. The flood comes. The vessel rides the waters for 7 days. When the rains stop, Atra-Hasis releases birds to test whether land has reappeared. Eventually, the boat grounds on a mountain. Atra-Hasis emerges, offers sacrifices, and the gods, hungry for offerings after days without worship, gather around. They regret their decision. Humanity is restored, though with new limitations imposed to prevent overpopulation. The Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet C, held in the British Museum as catalogue number K3375, presents the flood as a story within a story. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, seeks immortality and journeys to find Utnapishtim, the sole human granted eternal life. When Gilgamesh asks how Utnapishtim achieved this, the old man recounts the flood. His name is different again. Ziusudra becomes Atra-Hasis, becomes Utnapishtim, but the narrative is nearly identical. The gods meet in secret council. Enlil decrees a flood. Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, warns Utnapishtim by speaking to the reed wall of his house. The instructions are detailed: build a boat, coat it with bitumen, take aboard your family and representatives of every living creature. The dimensions of the vessel are specified: 120 cubits in each direction, creating a perfect cube. Utnapishtim obeys. The flood arrives with terrifying violence, described in vivid poetic language. 6 days and 7 nights the wind blew, the downpour, the tempest, and the flood overwhelmed the land. When the 7th day arrived, the tempest, the flood, the battle was over, which had struggled like a woman in labour. The sea grew calm, the storm abated, the flood ceased. Utnapishtim sends out a dove. It finds no resting place and returns. Then a swallow, same result. Then a raven. The raven does not return, indicating that land has emerged. Utnapishtim opens the hatches, releases the animals, and offers sacrifices on the mountain peak. The gods gather, drawn by the smell. Enlil is furious that anyone survived, but Ea intervenes, arguing that punishment should be proportionate and that total destruction was excessive. Enlil relents and grants Utnapishtim and his wife immortality, sending them to live at the edge of the world. 3 texts, 3 names for the survivor, slight variations in detail, but the core remains stable: divine decision, one man warned, vessel constructed, survival through water, restoration of humanity. The consistency suggests a deeply rooted tradition, told and retold across centuries, adapted to different languages and audiences, but preserving the essential structure. What is striking is the specificity. These are not vague legends about the world flooding and people starting over. They name the survivor. They specify the city where the warning was given, Shuruppak in the Gilgamesh account. They describe the construction techniques, bitumen caulking, reed bindings, precise dimensions. They give the duration, 7 days in most versions. They describe procedural details like the release of birds to test for dry land, a method that requires foreknowledge of bird behaviour and navigation. This level of detail is characteristic of historical memory, not pure invention. Myths can be vague. They can shift wildly between tellings. But when a story preserves specific procedural knowledge, how to waterproof a vessel, how to test for land without visual reference, how to manage livestock in confined space, it suggests that someone, somewhere in the chain of transmission, actually did these things, or at least believed they were describing real events. Mainstream scholarship interprets these texts as mythology. Flood stories, scholars argue, are common across cultures, often arising from river flooding in agricultural societies. Mesopotamia's reliance on the Tigris and Euphrates made destructive floods a recurring reality, and the narratives may encode collective trauma from particularly severe inundations. The gods' motivations, humanity's noise, overpopulation, divine caprice, are read as theological explanations for natural disasters, attempts to impose meaning on suffering. This interpretation is reasonable, but it struggles with certain details. If these are simply stories invented to explain why rivers flood, why include genealogical continuity? Why specify that Ziusudra was the king of Shuruppak, a real city with archaeological remains? Why name his father in some versions? Why connect him to the king list's genealogy, making him part of the antediluvian royal line? Why insist that what came after the flood was a restoration of what came before, rather than a new beginning? The texts do not present the flood as a cosmic reset. They present it as a disruption that was overcome. The gods did not start over with a new creation. They preserved one lineage chosen for its piety, its obedience, its attentiveness to divine instruction, and through that lineage the world was repopulated and kingship was re-established, which raises a question the texts cannot answer but nonetheless suggest. If the Sumerians believed kingship was restored after the flood, who restored it? If Ziusudra survived, what happened to his descendants? Did they become the post-flood kings? Is that why the king list insists on continuity across the flood? Because the Sumerians genuinely believed they were descended from the survivor. The tablets do not state this explicitly, but the pattern is there. Ziusudra, king of Shuruppak, survives. The king list places Ubaratutu, the last antediluvian king, in Shuruppak. After the flood, kingship resumes in Kish. The first post-flood king, Joshua, is followed by a dynasty that eventually produces Eme-Baragesi, a ruler confirmed by archaeology. The chain is unbroken in the text, even if history interrupted it. The Sumerians were not careless with their records. When they inscribed the king list, they did so with intent. When they preserved flood narratives across multiple texts and centuries, they did so because they believed the story mattered. And when they linked survival to kingship, genealogy to restoration, they were making a claim that their civilization was not invented. It was inherited from someone who came before, someone who endured the waters, the antediluvian problem. 8 kings ruled before the flood. The Well-Blundell Prism lists them by name and city, assigning to each a reign length that defies comprehension. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alalyar of Eridu, 36,000 years. Enmenluana of Bad Tabira, 43,200 years. The numbers are not random, they follow a pattern, multiples of a Sumerian numerical unit called a Sar, which equals 3,600. But even scaled, even interpreted symbolically, the figures remain impossible by any conventional understanding of human lifespan. Tablet WB62, housed with the Well-Blundell prism at the Ashmolean Museum, provides an alternate list of antediluvian rulers. Where the prism lists 8 kings across 5 cities, WB62 lists 10 kings, matching the number given by Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek around 280 BC, whose work survives only in fragments quoted by later historians. The names differ slightly, scribal variations, linguistic drift, or genuine divergence in oral tradition, but the structure is consistent. A sequence of enormously long-reigned kings before a flood, followed by drastically shorter reigns after. The consistency across independent sources is noteworthy. Berossus, writing for a Greek audience 2,000 years after the events he describes, preserves a flood tradition that matches Sumerian cuneiform tablets in basic outline. He names 10 antediluvian kings. He describes their reigns in terms that imply extraordinary duration, though he converts Sumerian numerical systems into Greek units, creating discrepancies in the exact figures. He places the 10th king, Xisuthros, his version of Ziusudra, at Shuruppak, and makes him the flood survivor. The alignment with WB62 is too precise to be coincidental. What were the Sumerians encoding? One interpretation is that the numbers are symbolic, representing eras rather than individual reigns. Each king might signify a dynasty, a cultural period, or a phase in the development of early cities. In this reading, Alulim ruled 28,800 years would mean the Alulim dynasty, or the Alulim cultural phase, lasted an extremely long time. The flood then represents a historical rupture, conquest, societal collapse, climate catastrophe, after which new dynasties arose, their reigns recorded with more realistic chronology because the record-keeping systems had improved. This interpretation has merit. It allows the king list to preserve historical memory without requiring belief in superhuman lifespans. It fits with the archaeological observation that early dynastic Mesopotamia underwent significant transitions, including the urbanization of Sumer, the rise of temple-centered economies, and the shift from village-based subsistence to city-state administration. But it creates new problems. If the antediluvian kings are symbolic, why do the post-flood kings suddenly become historical? And Mebaragesi is real. Gilgamesh, listed in the king list as a ruler of Uruk, may be based on a historical figure, though his exploits in the Epic of Gilgamesh are clearly mythologized. Where exactly does the list transition from symbol to history? And if the Sumerians intended symbolic interpretation, why did later scribes continue to treat the numbers as literal data, copying them with precision, totaling the years, and embedding the antediluvian section into administrative documents? Another interpretation is that the numbers encode astronomical cycles. The Sumerians were skilled astronomers, tracking celestial movements with remarkable accuracy. The number 3,600, 1 Sar, appears repeatedly in their mathematics, and some researchers have speculated that the antediluvian reign lengths correlate to observations of planetary periods, precession cycles, or other long-term astronomical phenomena. In this reading, the king list is not history or mythology, but a mathematical text disguised as genealogy, preserving knowledge of cosmic cycles in narrative form. This theory is compelling but difficult to verify. No cuneiform text explicitly links the antediluvian reign lengths to astronomy. The hypothesis requires assuming that the Sumerians encoded scientific knowledge in ways that would be unrecognizable to their own readers, which seems unlikely for a culture whose astronomical texts were quite direct and technical. If they wanted to record planetary cycles, they had systems for doing so. Why embed them in a king list? A third interpretation is that the numbers are corrupted. Early oral traditions may have preserved vague memories of very long ago, which later scribes, committed to precision, translated into specific numerical values based on the most ancient dating systems they had. Over time, these values calcified into seemingly literal reign lengths, even though the original intent was simply to signify deep antiquity. The flood becomes a chronological marker, dividing very ancient times from ancient times, and the post-flood kings are those for whom more reliable records existed. This interpretation is pragmatic and aligns with how oral traditions often function, but it still leaves the question of why the antediluvian kings are named. Vague antiquity does not require Alulim, Al-Aljar, and Enmen-Luana. It does not require specifying that Alulim ruled in Eridu, while Enmen-Jurana ruled in Sipar. These are specific claims about specific places and specific individuals, preserved across multiple manuscript traditions. If the goal was simply to signify a very long time ago, the simplest solution would be to omit names and cities entirely, beginning the list with the first post-flood king. But the Sumerians did not omit them. They preserved them, and they did so with care. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature notes that different manuscripts preserve slightly different spellings and reign lengths, but the names themselves are stable. Alulim is always Alulim. Eridu is always the first city. The last antediluvian king is always associated with Shuruppak, the city where Ziusudra received his warning. This consistency suggests intentionality. These names were not placeholders. They were part of the tradition, elements that could not be altered without breaking the integrity of the record. What if the reign lengths are neither symbolic, nor astronomical, nor corrupted, but simply the result of a different chronological system? What if the antediluvian scribes, or the oral traditions they inherited, measured time differently using units that later scribes misunderstood or mistranslated? This would explain why the numbers are multiples of standardized units like the SAR, and why they are recorded with such precision. They were real numbers in an original system, faithfully preserved even after the system itself was no longer understood. This theory is speculative, but it accounts for the data in a way that other interpretations struggle with. It allows the antediluvian kings to be historical figures without requiring acceptance of impossible lifespans. It explains why the numbers are preserved with such care, and it suggests that the flood represents a genuine rupture, not just in the historical record, but in the systems used to measure time, suggesting a cultural or technological reset significant enough that later civilizations had to reinterpret the old data in new frameworks. Whatever the numbers mean, they serve a function in the text. They separate the antediluvian world from the post-flood world. They mark a transition. And the Sumerians, who were meticulous record keepers, chose to preserve both sides of that transition in a single document, treating them as continuous. If the antediluvian kings were pure mythology, there would be no need to connect them to the historical dynasties. If they were symbolic, there would be no need to name them. But the king list does both. It names them, records their reign lengths, specifies their cities, and then, after the flood, continues the list without pause, as if the catastrophe changed the scale but not the structure. The implication is unavoidable. The Sumerians believed that what came after the flood was the continuation of what came before. And if they believed that, they must have believed that someone carried the knowledge across the waters, someone who remembered the names, someone who preserved the tradition, someone whose bloodline connected the old world to the new. The survivor's name: Ziusudra, Atra-Hasis, Utnapishtim, Suthros. 4 names across 4 linguistic traditions: Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian and Greek, describing the same figure, the man who survived the flood. The variations reflect linguistic evolution and translation choices, but the core identity remains stable. This was not a generic survivor. This was a specific individual with a name, a city, a role, and a family. In the Eridu Genesis, the oldest surviving account, he is Ziusudra, king of Shuruppak. The name is Sumerian, meaning he who saw life or he who found life, a title that suggests he achieved something extraordinary, either a long lifespan or a transition to a different mode of existence. The text describes him as humble, reverent, attentive to divine instruction. He stands in the shadow of the reed wall and listens as Enki warns him of the coming catastrophe. His response is obedience. Shuruppak was a real city located in southern Mesopotamia along the Euphrates. Modern Tel Farah marks its location. German archaeologists excavated the site in the early 20th century, uncovering layers of occupation dating back to the Jemdet Nazar period around 3000 BC. Among the finds were administrative tablets, and most intriguingly, a flood stratum, a layer of water-deposited clay separating earlier and later occupational levels. The stratum is not universal. It appears in some excavation trenches, but not others, suggesting a localized inundation rather than a total submersion. But its presence confirms that Shuruppak experienced at least one significant flood event in its early history. The instructions of Shuruppak, another Sumerian text, predates the flood narrative and takes the form of wisdom literature. In this text, an elderly king named Shuruppak gives advice to his son Ziusudra. The counsel is practical: how to manage property, treat workers, avoid disputes, honour the gods. The text does not mention a flood, but the relationship it establishes, Shuruppak as father, Ziusudra as son, provides a genealogical link. If Ziusudra was the son of King Shuruppak, and if the king list's final antediluvian ruler is Ubara-Tutu of Shuruppak, then either the names refer to the same figure or the tradition conflates distinct individuals from the same city. Either way, the connection between Ziusudra and Shuruppak is deeply embedded in Sumerian memory. In the Akkadian Atra-Hasis epic, the protagonist's name shifts to Atra-Hasis, meaning exceedingly wise. The semantic shift is revealing. Where the Sumerian name emphasizes life or survival, the Akkadian name emphasizes wisdom. Atra-Hasis is not just a survivor. He is someone who understands, who perceives correctly, who interprets divine will, and acts accordingly. The change suggests that by the time the Akkadian tradition was codified, the emphasis had moved from mere survival to the qualities that made survival possible: wisdom, discernment, obedience. The Atra-Hasis epic provides more detail about the survivor's response to the divine warning. Enki instructs him to tear down his house and use its materials to build the boat. Atra-Hasis does so, mobilizing his household and neighbours to assist. He loads the vessel with his family, craftsmen, animals and provisions. The inclusion of craftsmen is noteworthy. These are not just people, they are carriers of specialised knowledge: metalworking, weaving, pottery, carpentry. The text suggests that Atra-Hasis deliberately preserved not just life, but the skills necessary to rebuild civilization. When the flood ends and Atra-Hasis emerges, he does not simply rejoice. He immediately performs sacrifices, re-establishing the relationship between humanity and the gods. The gods, who have been without offerings during the flood, are drawn to the smoke of the sacrifice like flies. The phrase is striking. It humanizes the gods, depicting them as dependent on human worship, suggesting that the relationship is not one of total dominance, but of mutual need. Atra-Hasis understands this. His first act after survival is to resume the ritual obligations that define civilization. He is not starting over, he is restoring what was interrupted. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the survivor becomes Utnapishtim, an Akkadian name meaning he found life. The semantic overlap with Ziusudra's Sumerian name is deliberate, suggesting that the later Babylonian tradition was aware of the earlier Sumerian source and chose a name that preserved its meaning. Utnapishtim's account is the most detailed, providing explicit measurements for the boat, descriptions of the caulking process, and a vivid depiction of the flood's violence. But what makes his version unique is the ending. Utnapishtim and his wife are granted immortality by the gods and removed from the human world, sent to live at the mouth of the rivers, a distant place beyond mortal reach. This immortality complicates the genealogical question. If Utnapishtim was removed from human society, how could he be the ancestor of post-flood kings? The king list insists on continuity, but the Gilgamesh epic suggests a rupture. One possible reconciliation is that Utnapishtim's children remained mortal and became the post-flood population, while only he and his wife were granted eternal life. This would allow both traditions to coexist, Utnapishtim as the immortal survivor living at the edge of the world, and his descendants as the founders of the post-flood dynasties. Berossus, writing in Greek for a Hellenistic audience, calls the survivor Ziusudros, a clear Greek rendering of Ziusudra. His account, preserved in fragments by later historians, aligns closely with the Mesopotamian sources. Ziusudros is the 10th king of the antediluvian period. He is warned by the god Kronos, the Greek equivalent of Enki, through a dream. He builds a vessel, seals it with pitch, loads it with family and animals, and survives the flood. When the waters recede, Ziusudros and his family disembark. He offers sacrifices, and then he vanishes, taken by the gods. But before his disappearance, he instructs his sons to return to Babylon and recover the writings he had buried at Sippar before the flood, so that knowledge would not be lost. This final detail, the buried writings, is unique to Berossus and does not appear in the earlier cuneiform sources. But it is consistent with the broader theme. The survivor is not just preserving life, he is preserving knowledge. The pre-flood world possessed something, texts, sciences, rituals, genealogies, that needed to be transmitted. And Ziusudros / Ziusudra / Atra-Hasis Utnapishtim was the one who ensured that transmission occurred. The consistency of this figure across linguistic and cultural boundaries is remarkable. The name changes, the details shift, but the core remains: a righteous king warned by a god who builds a vessel, survives a catastrophic flood, and becomes the link between the old world and the new. He is not a generic Noah figure. He is a specific individual, embedded in a specific genealogy, ruling from a specific city. The traditions disagree on whether he achieved immortality, whether he had sons who continued his line, whether he buried texts or simply restored sacrifices. But they agree on his role. He was the one who preserved the thread. And if the thread was preserved, then the genealogy recorded in the king list, the unbroken sequence from pre-flood to post-flood, is not invention. It is memory. The memory of a bloodline that endured, a family that survived, a knowledge that was carried across the waters and planted in the soil of the new world. After the kingship descended again, then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over and the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. This sentence appears in every version of the Sumerian king list. It is not elaborated, it is not explained. It is stated as fact, as if the mechanism of descent was self-evident to the original audience. But for modern readers, the phrasing is deeply strange. Kingship descends, not invented, not established, not claimed, descended, as if kingship existed somewhere else, heaven according to the text, and was transferred back to earth after the flood's disruption. The Sumerians understood kingship as a divine institution. Kings did not rule by their own authority, but by the favour of the gods, granted through ritual, confirmed through success in war and prosperity in peace. But the language of descent suggests something more than metaphorical divine favour. It suggests that kingship as a concept, as a structure, as a system of governance, had to be reintroduced to humanity after the flood because the old order had been destroyed. This raises a question. If kingship descended, who received it? The king list answers immediately the kingship was in Kish, not Eridu, which had been the first city before the flood, not Shuruppak, where Ziusudra had been king. Kish, a city in northern Babylonia, distinct from the southern cities of the antediluvian era. The shift is geographic and symbolic. The old centres of power were gone or diminished. A new city, Kish, became the seat of authority. The first post-flood king is Jashur, also called Gar-Ur in some manuscripts. The name means hero or warrior, a title rather than a personal name, which may explain why it appears inconsistently across sources. He is credited with a reign of 1,000–1,200 years, still impossibly long by modern standards, but drastically shorter than the 28,800 or 36,000 year reigns of the antediluvian kings. The reduction suggests a shift in chronology, a recalibration of time measurement, or a transition from symbolic to more historical record keeping. Jusha is followed by Kulasinabel, who reigns 960 years. Then Nanjaclisma, Entara-Ana, Babum, Puanum, names preserved with slight variations across manuscripts. The reigns shorten progressively. By the time the list reaches the 10th post-flood king of Kish, Etana, the reign lengths have dropped to hundreds of years, approaching a range that could plausibly represent generational succession rather than individual reigns, if interpreted as dynasties rather than single rulers. Etana is a pivotal figure. The king list describes him as the shepherd who ascended to heaven and consolidated all the foreign countries. This phrase echoes the earlier statement that kingship descended from heaven, creating a symmetry. Kingship comes down, Etana goes up. Whatever ascending to heaven means in this context, a mystical vision, a ritual journey, a metaphor for divine favour, Etana is credited with unifying the region, establishing Kish's dominance over surrounding territories, and consolidating the fragmented post-flood world into a coherent political order. An independent text, the myth of Etana, survives in multiple fragments and describes Etana's quest to heaven to obtain the plant of birth so that his wife could bear a child. With the help of an eagle, he flies upward, witnessing the earth shrink beneath him until it becomes indistinguishable from the surrounding ocean. The journey is perilous, and the outcome of the myth varies across versions. But the genealogical concern is explicit. Etana needs an heir. Without a son, his line ends, and the text suggests that obtaining this heir required divine intervention, accessed through an extraordinary journey. The king list confirms that Etana did have a son, Bali, who succeeded him. This continuity, father to son, generation to generation, becomes the pattern. Enma-Baragesi, the 22nd king of Kish, is succeeded by his son Aga. The Tumul inscription, an independent Sumerian text, confirms this genealogy. Enma-Baragesi, the king in Nippur, built the house of Enlil. Aga, the son of Enma-Baragesi, made the Tumul preeminent. The mention of Nippur, a religious centre distinct from Kish, suggests that Enma-Baragesi's authority extended beyond his home city, a claim supported by the king list description of him capturing the weapons of Elam, a foreign land to the east. Enma-Baragesi is the first post-flood king confirmed by archaeology. The alabaster vase fragment bearing his name, housed in the Iraq Museum, was inscribed during his lifetime or shortly after, making it contemporary evidence rather than later mythologization. His existence proves that at least part of the post-flood king list records actual history, which means the question of where mythology ends and history begins must be reconsidered. If Enma-Baragesi was real, and if the king list places him in a continuous genealogy stretching back through Etana, through Jashur, across the flood to the antediluvian kings, then either the entire genealogy is suspect, or more of it is historical than mainstream scholarship assumes. The phrase "the kingship descended from heaven" may not be purely theological. It may encode a historical claim that the post-flood dynasties were not founded by warlords or tribal chiefs who seized power, but by individuals who inherited authority, who received the right to rule from a source that predated the flood. If Ziusudra was the last antediluvian king of Shuruppak, and if he survived the flood, then kingship did not need to be invented anew. It simply needed to be transferred, descended to the survivors who carried the bloodline and the knowledge. Kish's prominence in the post-flood period is archaeologically attested. Excavations at the site conducted by various teams throughout the 20th century, reveal extensive early dynastic occupation, monumental architecture, and evidence of regional influence. The city was a major centre during the period when the king list claims it held kingship, which lends credibility to the text's political assertions. But the king list does more than assert political dominance. It claims genealogical continuity, it names fathers and sons, it preserves family lines, and it treats the post-flood dynasties as legitimate successors to the antediluvian order. This is not how conquest narratives function. When one dynasty overthrows another, the victors do not typically claim descent from the defeated. They claim superior strength, divine favour transferred to them, or justice against corrupt predecessors. But the king list does not present the post-flood dynasties as conquerors. It presents them as inheritors, as if the right to rule passed naturally from the old world to the new, carried by the bloodline of the survivor. Which brings the inquiry back to Ziusudra. If he was the last antediluvian king, or closely connected to the last king, and if he survived, what happened to his children? Did they establish Kish? Did Jashur descend from Ziusudra's line? The texts do not state this directly, but the implication hovers over the genealogies. The kingship descended because someone was there to receive it, someone who remembered what kingship was, someone who carried the authority, the rituals, the knowledge of how civilization functioned before the waters rose. The Sumerians did not present the post-flood world as a blank slate. They presented it as a restoration. Cities rebuilt, temples reconstructed, kingship resumed, and at the centre of that restoration was a genealogy, a family line, a bloodline that connected the survivors to the rulers who came before. The first name we can touch, Imebra-Gessi, is the hinge. Before him, the king list blurs into figures whose historicity is uncertain, Etana, who ascended to heaven, Jashur, whose name might be a title, the long-reigned kings whose existence is attested only in text. After him, the archaeological record begins to solidify. Gilgamesh of Uruk, Masanapada of Ur, kings whose names appear in inscriptions, whose cities can be excavated, whose reigns can be dated with increasing precision. But Imebra-Gessi stands at the threshold. He is the first post-flood king whose name appears in a contemporary source, confirming that the king list, whatever its mythological elements, is grounded in historical reality. The alabaster vase fragment was discovered during early 20th century excavations near Baghdad, in the ruins of a structure associated with Kish. The inscription is brief, written in an archaic form of cuneiform, Mebra-Gessi, king of Kish. The spelling differs slightly from later versions of his name, Emebara-Gessi or Emebara-Gessi, but the identification is secure. The cuneiform style dates the inscription to the early dynastic II period, approximately 2900 to 2800 BC, making it one of the oldest royal inscriptions ever found. This is not a later commemoration. This is not a myth recorded centuries after the fact. This is a label, a dedication, a record created during or shortly after Emebara-Gessi's reign, when his authority was active and his name commanded recognition. The fragment is small, unassuming, but its implications are vast. It confirms that the king list genealogy, at least by the time it reaches Emebara-Gessi, has transitioned from whatever the antediluvian section represents, mythology, symbolic history, corrupted chronology, into actual historical record. According to the king list, Emebara-Gessi was the 22nd ruler of the first dynasty of Kish. His father Ilthasadem preceded him. His son, Aga, succeeded him. The Tamil inscription, an independent Sumerian text, confirms the father-son relationship between Emebara-Gessi and Aga and credits both with construction projects at religious sites. Emebara-Gessi built the temple of Enlil at Nippur. Aga enhanced the Tummal, a sacred precinct. These are public works, acts of piety and statecraft, the kind of achievements that kings commission to demonstrate divine favour and secure their legacy. The king list also attributes a military achievement to Emebara-Gessi. He who carried away as spoil the weapons of the land of Elam became king. Elam was a civilization to the east of Sumer in what is now southwestern Iran. The phrase suggests a successful military campaign, the capture of enemy armaments, and the prestige that victory conferred. Warfare in early dynastic Mesopotamia was constant. City-states competed for resources, irrigation rights, and regional dominance. A king who defeated Elam and seized its weapons would have enhanced his reputation significantly, both among his own people and neighbouring cities. There is a narrative detail embedded in the king list that complicates Enmebaragesi's story. According to some manuscripts, Dumuzid the fisherman, the third king of the first dynasty of Uruk, was captured by Enmebaragesi. This would make Enmebaragesi not only a foreign conqueror, but a domestic rival, asserting Kish's dominance over Uruk, one of the most powerful city-states in Sumer. The claim is contested by scholars. Different manuscript traditions place the capture differently, and the chronology is uncertain, but the implication is clear. Enmebaragesi was not a minor provincial ruler. He was a significant regional power, capable of projecting military force beyond his own city. Yet, despite his military achievements, Enmebaragesi is not remembered primarily as a conqueror. He is remembered as a builder, a restorer of sacred spaces, a king who fulfilled his obligations to the gods. His construction projects at Nippur, Sumer's religious centre, suggest that he commanded enough authority and resources to undertake public works far from his own city, reinforcing his legitimacy through piety rather than force alone. This dual legacy, warrior and builder, conqueror and temple restorer, fits the Mesopotamian ideal of kingship. A king's role was to protect his city, expand its influence, maintain order, and honour the gods. Success in war demonstrated divine favour. Construction of temples secured that favour for future generations. Enmebaragesi did both, and in doing so, he established a model that his successors would follow. His son, Uga, inherited the throne, but faced a challenge from a rising power in Uruk. According to the Epic of Gilgamesh and Aga, a Sumerian poem preserved in fragmentary form, Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, refused to submit to Kish's authority. Aga besieged Uruk in response. The poem describes a confrontation at the city walls, a debate over vassalage and independence, and eventually Gilgamesh's victory, forcing Aga to withdraw. The historicity of this specific confrontation is uncertain, but the broader pattern is clear. Kish's dominance, established by Enmebaragesi, was contested by the next generation. Uruk, a city with its own ambitions and its own claims to kingship, challenged Kish's hegemony. The balance of power shifted southward. The king list reflects this shift. After Aga's reign, the kingship is said to have left Kish and moved to Uruk, where it was held by Gilgamesh and his successors. This is not described as conquest, but as transference, as if kingship was an object that could be passed from city to city, dynasty to dynasty. The language suggests that the Sumerians conceptualized political authority as something external to any individual ruler or city, something that existed independently and could be possessed temporarily by whoever the gods favoured. Enmebaragesi's place in this system is pivotal. He is the first post-flood king whose existence is archaeologically confirmed, which means he is the first ruler we can say with certainty belonged to the genealogical sequence the king list describes. If the king list is reliable at the point of Enmebaragesi, how far back does that reliability extend? To his father Iltusadum? To Etana, 10 generations earlier? To Jusha, the first post-flood king? And if those names have any historical grounding, what does that imply about the pre-flood names? The text does not answer these questions, but Enmebaragesi's existence forces them open. He is not a myth. He was a real man, ruling a real city, building real temples, fighting real wars, and he sits within a genealogy that stretches backward across the flood. The chain may be mythologized, compressed, or distorted, but it is not entirely fabricated. Atra-Hasis proves that, which means the bloodline the Sumerians claimed, the unbroken line from antediluvian kings through flood survivor to post-flood dynasties, is not pure invention. It is rooted, at least partially, in historical memory. And if Atra-Hasis' name survived in stone, perhaps other names in the sequence are also more than legend. Cities beneath the mud. The texts claim a flood. The cities hold the evidence. Between 1922 and 1934, Sir Leonard Woolley led excavations at one of Sumer's most prominent city-states, located in southern Mesopotamia near the ancient coastline of the Persian Gulf. Woolley's team dug trenches deep into the mound, cutting through layers of occupation dating back thousands of years. At a depth of approximately 40 feet, beneath the remains of early dynastic houses and streets, the excavators encountered something unexpected: a thick layer of water-deposited clay, devoid of artifacts, separating the later occupational levels from earlier prehistoric strata beneath. The layer was substantial, over 10 feet thick in some areas, and its consistency indicated rapid deposition by floodwaters rather than gradual accumulation. Woolley interpreted it as evidence of the flood described in the Sumerian king list and the Gilgamesh epic, a catastrophic inundation that had buried the earlier settlement and forced survivors to rebuild on top of the sediment. The discovery made international headlines. Woolley announced that he had found proof of Noah's flood, the biblical deluge, and newspapers ran stories declaring that archaeology had confirmed the ancient narratives. The claim was premature. Subsequent analysis revealed complications. The flood layer at was localized, appearing in some excavation trenches, but not others, suggesting that the inundation had not covered the entire site uniformly. More significantly, the flood layer's date did not align with the flood layers found at other Mesopotamian sites. Ur's flood deposit dated to the Ubaid period, approximately 4000 BC, far earlier than the early dynastic period when the Sumerian king list places the flood. If this was the flood of the texts, the chronology did not match. But was not the only site with flood evidence. Excavations at Kish, conducted by a joint Oxford Field Museum expedition, uncovered a flood stratum dated to approximately 2900 BC at the transition between the Jemdet Nasser period and early dynastic first. This date is far closer to the time frame suggested by the king list. If the flood occurred just before the kingship resumed in Kish, and if Atra-Hasis ruled around 2800 BC, then a flood around 2900 BC would fit the sequence. The Kish flood layer was not as thick as Ur's, only a few feet rather than 10, but it was clearly water deposited, and it separated earlier and later occupational phases. Shuruppak, the city where Ziusudra received his warning, also yielded flood evidence. German archaeologists excavating the site in the early 20th century found a layer of water-deposited sand and clay separating Jemdet Nasser materials from early dynastic remains. The layer's thickness varied, up to 3 feet in some areas, but its presence confirmed that Shuruppak had experienced significant flooding at roughly the same period as Kish. The alignment is noteworthy. The city where the texts place the flood survivor shows archaeological evidence of flooding at the time when the king list places the flood. Other sites show no such evidence. Excavations at Uruk, Lagash, and Eridu have not uncovered comparable flood strata from this period, suggesting that the inundation, if it occurred, was not universal. It may have been a massive regional flood affecting the central Euphrates Valley. Kish and Shuruppak lie along the river's course, while leaving cities further south or north relatively unaffected. This would explain the textual tradition of a world-destroying deluge. For the inhabitants of Kish and Shuruppak, the flood would have been total, wiping out everything they knew, even as other regions remained untouched. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers are prone to catastrophic flooding. Unlike the Nile, which floods predictably and gently, depositing fertile silt, the Mesopotamian rivers can rise suddenly and violently, especially when winter rains combine with snow melt from the Armenian highlands. Levees can fail, irrigation canals can overflow, entire settlements can be inundated within hours. Historical records from later periods describe floods that destroyed cities, drowned populations, and required years of reconstruction. A particularly severe flood around 2900 BC could easily have left a lasting trauma in collective memory, especially if it struck during a period of political centralization when Kish was emerging as a dominant power. But the textual tradition does not describe a regional flood. It describes a divine decision to destroy humanity, waters that cover the earth, and a single family's survival. The hyperbole is characteristic of mythological narratives which tend to universalize local disasters, transforming them into cosmic events. Yet the hyperbole does not invalidate the underlying memory. A catastrophic flood at Kish and Shuruppak around 2900 BC would have devastated the most politically important region of Sumer at a critical moment in its development. For survivors, the flood would have seemed total, the destruction absolute, the loss incomprehensible. And if the flood was real, then the survival accounts take on new significance. Ziusudra, warned by Enki, building a vessel, riding the waters, re-emerging to restore civilization, this is not pure invention. This is a story shaped by the memory of an actual disaster and the actual survival of individuals who endured it. The details may be mythologized, divine councils, measurements of cubits, birds released to test for land, but the core is historical, a catastrophic flood, a few survivors, and the reconstruction of society afterward. The question is whether those survivors included the royal bloodline, whether Ziusudra, king of Shuruppak, was among those who endured, whether his descendants became the post-flood kings of Kish. The texts claim this explicitly. The king list insists on genealogical continuity. The flood narratives emphasize that the survivor was a king, not a commoner, and the archaeological evidence confirms that the cities associated with the flood tradition, Shuruppak, Kish, experienced actual inundations at the time when the texts place the catastrophe. None of this proves that a single royal family survived and re-established kingship, but it demonstrates that the Sumerian flood tradition is not baseless myth. It is rooted in a real environmental disaster that struck the heartland of early Mesopotamian civilization at a formative moment. And the survivors of that disaster, whoever they were, became the founders of the early dynastic period, the builders of the great cities, the ancestors of the kings whose names we can now confirm in stone and clay. The mud holds memory. Beneath the layers of occupation, beneath the streets and houses of later centuries, the flood stratum remains, a silent witness to the day when the waters rose, the world drowned, and a few endured to tell the story. The inheritance of wisdom. The flood narratives do not present survival as mere physical endurance. They present it as the preservation of knowledge. Ziusudra is not chosen randomly. He is chosen because of his character, pious, attentive, obedient, and because he possesses something worth preserving. In some traditions, that something is made explicit. He is the keeper of wisdom, the guardian of pre-flood knowledge, the one who ensures that civilization does not have to start from nothing. The Instructions of Shuruppak is one of the oldest surviving examples of wisdom literature, a genre that flourished in ancient Mesopotamia. The text takes the form of a father's advice to his son, practical counsel on how to live successfully in a complex society. The father is Shuruppak, the city's king. The son is Ziusudra. The advice covers agriculture, property management, marriage, dispute resolution, and religious duty. Some maxims are pragmatic: do not buy a donkey that brays, it will split your grain. Others are ethical: do not curse with violence, violence will come back to you. Still others reflect a conservative worldview: do not honour a slave woman in your house, do not let her take control. What is striking is not the content. Much of it is conventional, but the fact that this advice was written down, copied and preserved for over 1,000 years. Multiple manuscript copies survive, dating from the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BCE, but internal evidence suggests the text is far older, possibly originating in the early dynastic period or even earlier. The language is archaic. The concerns reflect a pre-urban or early urban context, and the genealogical framing, Shurupak to Ziusudra, connects the text directly to the flood tradition. If Ziusudra was the son of King Shurupak, and if he survived the flood, then the instructions of Shurupak represents the knowledge he carried with him into the post-flood world. The maxims are not divine revelations, they are accumulated cultural wisdom. The practical know how that allows a society to function. When Ziusudra built his vessel and loaded it with his family, he was not just preserving biological life, he was preserving the memory of how to organise labour, resolve conflicts, manage resources, and honour the gods. He was carrying civilization itself. Another text complicates the picture. The myth of Adapa, preserved in fragmentary Akkadian copies from the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, describes a figure named Adapa who is created by the god Enki and given exceptional wisdom. Adapa serves as a priest in Eridu, the oldest of the antediluvian cities according to the king list. He performs rituals, bakes bread, provides water, and ensures that the offerings to Ea are properly made. One day, while fishing in the Persian Gulf, the south wind capsizes his boat. In anger, Adapa curses the wind and breaks its wing, causing the wind to cease for 7 days. The gods notice. Anu, the sky god, summons Adapa to heaven to answer for his offence. Ea warns Adapa not to eat or drink anything offered to him in heaven, as it will be the food and water of death. Adapa obeys, ascending to heaven, presenting his case, and refusing the food offered by Anu. But the food was not poison. It was the bread and water of immortality, the gift that would have made Adapa eternal. By refusing, he dooms humanity to mortality. Anu, recognizing Ea's deception, sends Adapa back to Earth, where he continues his priestly duties until his death. The myth of Adapa does not mention the flood, and Adapa is not identified as the flood survivor. But the overlap is significant. Adapa is associated with Eridu, the first city. He possesses extraordinary wisdom given by Enki, the same god who warns Ziusudra. He is a priest, a mediator between gods and humanity, and he is presented as the reason humanity lost access to immortality, echoing the theme of a pre-flood golden age when humans lived longer or differently than they do now. Some scholars have speculated that Adapa and Ziusudra represent different facets of the same tradition, one emphasizing wisdom and priestly knowledge, the other emphasizing survival and genealogical continuity. Both are chosen by Enki, both are granted exceptional status, and both are connected to the transition from the antediluvian world to the post-flood world, even if the Adapa myth does not explicitly mention the catastrophe. Berossus, in his fragmentary account preserved by later authors, adds a detail not found in the earlier cuneiform sources. Before the flood, Ziusudra is instructed by the god to write down the history of the world, its beginning, middle, and end, and to bury the tablets at Sippar, the city of the sun god. After the flood, Ziusudra tells his sons to return to Sippar, dig up the tablets, and use them to rebuild civilization. The writings, Berossus claims, contained all the knowledge necessary to restore what had been lost. This motif, pre-flood knowledge preserved in written form and recovered after the disaster, does not appear in the Sumerian or Akkadian flood narratives. It may be a later elaboration, an addition made by Hellenistic era scholars to align the Mesopotamian flood tradition with Greek ideas about the preservation of wisdom. Or it may preserve an authentic element of the tradition that was not emphasized in the earlier texts. Either way, it reinforces the central theme: the flood did not erase knowledge. It was interrupted, hidden, and then recovered. Civilization did not start over from ignorance. It was restored by those who remembered. The practical implications are enormous. If the post-flood dynasties, inherited knowledge from pre-flood civilization, then the achievements of early dynastic Sumer, writing, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, law, were not invented spontaneously. They were recovered, relearned, or transmitted by survivors who had access to earlier traditions. This would explain the seeming suddenness of Sumerian civilization's emergence. Around 3200 BC, cuneiform appears, fully formed as an administrative tool. Cities expand rapidly, monumental architecture appears, trade networks extend across the Near East. The conventional explanation is that these developments arose from the gradual intensification of agricultural surplus and social complexity. But the king list suggests another possibility, that the Sumerians were not inventing civilization, they were restoring it. This interpretation is speculative and unorthodox. Mainstream archaeology sees no evidence of a pre-Sumerian civilization with comparable achievements. The Ubaid period, which precedes Sumer, shows village-level organisation, not urbanisation. But the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. If a pre-flood civilization existed and was destroyed by catastrophic flooding, its remains would be deeply buried under layers of silt, difficult to access archaeologically. And if the survivors carried knowledge orally and in portable forms, tablets, rituals, techniques, then the material culture might not survive even if the knowledge did. What survives is the texts. And the texts insist, again and again, that knowledge was not lost, it was preserved by a king who listened to the gods, by a priest who understood the rituals, by a father who instructed his son, by a survivor who carried the memory of the old world into the new, what the Greeks remembered. By the time Berossus wrote his Babyloniaca in the 3rd century BC, Mesopotamia had endured millennia of political upheaval. The Sumerian city-states had risen and fallen. The Akkadian Empire had unified and collapsed. Babylon had ascended under Hammurabi, then declined under Assyrian domination. Alexander the Great had conquered the region, bringing Greek culture and language to the ancient heartland of cuneiform civilization. The old traditions were fading, the tablets crumbling in neglected archives, the languages becoming obsolete. Berossus was a priest of Bel-Marduk, Babylon's chief deity, and he had access to the temple libraries where ancient texts were still preserved. Writing in Greek for a Hellenistic audience, he set out to compile a history of Babylon from its legendary origins to his own time. His work, titled Babyloniaca, was divided into 3 books, the first covering the creation and antediluvian period, the second covering the flood to the Neo-Babylonian period, and the third covering the Persian and Seleucid periods. Only fragments survive, quoted by later Greek and Roman historians, Josephus, Eusebius, Syncellus, but those fragments preserve details that align remarkably with the cuneiform sources. Berossus lists 10 antediluvian kings, matching the number in tablet WB 62, rather than the 8 kings of the Well-Blundell prism. His names are Greek transliterations of Sumerian and Akkadian originals, Aloros, Luloum, Alaparos, Luvar, Amalon, Leng-Luar, and so on. The reign lengths he gives are immense. Aloros rules for 10 Sars, or 36,000 years, Alaparos for 3 Sars, or 10,800 years, indicating that he is drawing from sources that use the same numerical system as the king list, even if his Greek audience would not have understood the Sumerian mathematical units. Berossus places the 10th king, Ziusudra, in the city of Shuruppak, matching the Sumerian tradition that Ziusudra was king there. When the gods decree a flood, Ziusudra receives a revelation in a dream, instructed by the god Kronos Berossus's interpretation of Enki to build a ship, seal it with bitumen, and load it with family, friends, and animals. The flood comes, lasts for a period, and then recedes. Ziusudra releases birds to test for land, a detail found in the Gilgamesh epic, but not in the Sumerian Eridu Genesis. confirming that Berossus is synthesizing multiple cuneiform sources, not inventing his narrative. When the waters recede, Ziusudra disembarks with his wife, daughter, and the pilot of the vessel. They offer sacrifices. Then, according to Berossus, a divine voice speaks from the air, instructing Ziusudra and his family to return to Babylon because they have been granted immortality and are being taken to dwell with the gods. But before he vanishes, Ziusudra tells the survivors with him that they must journey to Sippar and recover the writings he buried there before the flood. Those writings, he explains, contain all the knowledge necessary to rebuild civilization, the history of the world, the sciences, the arts, the divine decrees. This detail about the buried writings is unique to Berossus. It does not appear in the Eridu Genesis, the Atra-Hasis epic, or the Gilgamesh flood narrative. Some scholars dismiss it as a Hellenistic addition, influenced by Greek traditions of ancient wisdom preserved in hidden libraries. Others suggest it reflects an authentic Mesopotamian motif that simply was not emphasized in the surviving cuneiform sources. Sippar was indeed associated with the sun god Shamash and was considered an ancient centre of learning. If any city would have been chosen as a repository for pre-flood knowledge, Sippar is a plausible candidate. What is undeniable is that Berossus, writing 2,000 years after the flood he describes, preserves the same core narrative found in Sumerian sources dating to the 3rd millennium BC. The names align, the cities align, the sequence of events aligns. This continuity across linguistic, cultural, and temporal boundaries suggests a deeply rooted tradition maintained by temple scribes and priests who considered the flood a foundational event in human history. Berossus also provides post-flood genealogies, though the fragments are incomplete. He describes dynasties ruling from Babylon, tracing the succession of kings through the centuries. The details do not align perfectly with the Sumerian king list. Berossus is writing from a Babylonian rather than Sumerian perspective, and his sources likely included later Akkadian and Babylonian chronicles, but the structure is similar. Kingship resumes after the flood. Dynasties succeed one another. The genealogical thread is preserved. The fact that Berossus felt compelled to write this history for a Greek audience indicates that the flood tradition was not obscure or marginal. It was central to Mesopotamian identity, the foundational myth that explained how the current world came into being. And Berossus, as a priest with access to the archives, was transmitting knowledge that he believed to be historically true, not merely symbolic. His account is not framed as allegory, it is framed as a factual report of events that shaped the course of civilization. Josephus, the Jewish historian writing in the 1st century CE, quotes Berossus approvingly, noting the alignment between the Babylonian flood tradition and the biblical account of Noah. Other Greek and Roman writers treated Berossus as a reliable source on Mesopotamian history, citing him alongside Homer and Herodotus. The credibility afforded to Berossus suggests that his work was not dismissed as mythology, but was taken seriously as historical testimony from an ancient and authoritative tradition. By the time Berossus wrote, cuneiform literacy was declining. The old scribal schools had closed. The temples were being repurposed. Within a few centuries, the ability to read cuneiform would be lost entirely, not to be recovered until the 19th century, when scholars like Henry Rawlinson deciphered the script. But before that loss occurred, Berossus translated the essentials into Greek, preserving for posterity the Mesopotamian memory of the flood, the survivor, and the genealogy that stretched from the antediluvian world to his own time. That he considered this knowledge worth preserving, worth translating, worth defending to a sceptical Greek audience, suggests that he believed it was true, not metaphorically true, historically true. The flood had happened, the kings had ruled, the bloodline had been preserved, and if a Babylonian priest in the 3rd century BC with access to the oldest archives in the world, believe the tradition was factual, perhaps the question is not whether modern scholars should believe it, but whether the Mesopotamians who lived closest to the events had reason to remember them accurately. The genealogical thread. Genealogy mattered to the Sumerians in ways difficult for modern audiences to grasp. In a world where literacy was restricted to scribal elites and historical records were maintained by temple bureaucracies, family lineage was one of the few constants that connected the present to the past. A king's authority was not just political or military, it was genealogical. Legitimacy flowed through blood, from father to son, from ancestor to heir. To rule was to inherit not just power but identity. The Sumerian king list is obsessive about this. It does not simply name kings, it names sons. Bali, the son of Etana, ruled for 400 years. Emebragesi, the son of Iltuzadam, ruled for 900 years. Aga, the son of Emebragesi, ruled for 625 years. The repetition is not accidental, it is structural. The list is a genealogy as much as a political chronicle, tracing the bloodline through which kingship passed. This concern extends across the flood. The 8 antediluvian kings are listed by name and city, though their genealogical relationships are not always specified. But the pattern suggests succession. One king follows another, and the kingship moves from city to city, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, in a sequence that implies transfer of authority rather than simultaneous rule. Then the flood occurs, and immediately afterward, the list resumes with the same structure: names, cities, successions, sons inheriting from fathers. The implication is unmistakable. The post-flood dynasties are presented as the continuation of the pre-flood royal line, not a replacement, not a new beginning, a continuation. If this claim has any historical basis, then Ziusudra was not just a random survivor, he was a king, or closely related to one. The instructions of Shuruppak present him as the son of King Shuruppak. The king list places the last antediluvian king, Ubaratutu, in Shuruppak. These may be the same figure, or they may represent a conflation of separate traditions, but the association is consistent. Shuruppak the city, Ziusudra the survivor, kingship, preserved through catastrophe. What happened to Ziusudra's descendants? The texts diverge. In the Gilgamesh epic, Utnapishtim is removed from the human world, granted immortality, and sent to a distant paradise. His removal suggests that he left no mortal heirs, or that his descendants were not part of the post-flood royal line. But in other traditions, Ziusudra's role as ancestor is implicit. The king list does not name him directly in the post-flood section, but the continuity it asserts, kingship descending from heaven, resuming in Kish, requires someone to receive it. And if kingship is genealogical, then whoever received it must have been the rightful heir, the one who carried the bloodline from the old world to the new. Jushur, the first post-flood king of Kish, remains mysterious. His name appears inconsistently across manuscripts, and no independent sources confirm his existence. He may be a symbolic figure, representing the re-establishment of kingship rather than a historical individual, or he may be a heavily mythologized memory of a real founder whose achievements were embellished over time. But whether Jushur was real or symbolic, the dynasty he inaugurates is historical. By the time the list reaches Enmebragesi, the archaeology confirms the genealogy. Emebragesi's son Aga succeeded him. The Tumul inscription confirms this. Independent cuneiform texts mention both father and son, placing them in a clear generational relationship. This is not myth. This is documented succession, father to son, bloodline to bloodline. And if this succession is reliable, then the genealogies that precede it, Emebragesi's father, his grandfather, the dynasty stretching back through Etana to Jushur, may also preserve authentic family lines, even if the details have been distorted by time and retelling. Etana is pivotal. The king list describes him as the shepherd who ascended to heaven and consolidated all the foreign countries. The myth of Etana, an independent text, confirms his extraordinary status and his concern with producing an heir. Without a son, his dynasty ends. But the king list confirms that he did have a son, Bali, who ruled after him. This concern with succession, with the continuation of the bloodline, reflects a society deeply invested in genealogical legitimacy. The concern did not begin with Etana. It appears in the antediluvian section, where each king is associated with a city, and the kingship passes from one city to another in a sequence that suggests deliberate transfer. It continues in the post-flood section, where dynasties rise and fall, but the kingship itself persists, moving from Kish to Uruk to Ur, always within a framework that emphasizes descent, inheritance, and blood. The Mesopotamian worldview understood kingship as something external to any individual. Kings died, dynasties ended, cities fell. But kingship itself endured because it was divine in origin, a gift from the gods that could be transferred but never destroyed. And if kingship was divine in origin, then the bloodline that carried it was sacred, chosen, preserved by the gods for a purpose. This is why the flood narratives emphasize Ziusudra's piety. He is not chosen because he is strong or clever. He is chosen because he is attentive, obedient, worthy. And worthiness in the Mesopotamian context is a genealogical quality as much as a personal one. A worthy king comes from a worthy lineage. The gods do not grant kingship to anyone. They grant it to the bloodline they have chosen. If the Sumerians believed this, then their insistence on genealogical continuity across the flood is not propaganda, it is theology. The post-flood kings are legitimate because they descend from the pre-flood kings. The kingship descended from heaven because it had existed in heaven during the catastrophe, waiting to be restored to the chosen bloodline. And the chosen bloodline survived because the gods ensured it. Modern historians dismiss this as myth, and perhaps it is. But it is myth that shaped how the Sumerians understood themselves, their rulers, and their place in the cosmos. They believed they were heirs to something older, inheritors of a tradition that predated the flood, carriers of a bloodline that had endured the destruction of the world and emerged to rebuild it. Whether that belief was based on historical memory or theological invention is the question the tablets cannot fully answer. But they insist repeatedly and consistently that the bloodline was preserved, that the flood was survived, that the kingship resumed. The problem mainstream cannot answer. The orthodox scholarly interpretation of the Sumerian king list treats it as a mythologized political document, a piece of propaganda designed to legitimize the dominance of specific dynasties by linking them to a legendary past. The antediluvian kings are symbolic. The flood is metaphorical or based on localized river flooding. The post-flood dynasties are historical, but their connection to the pre-flood section is an invented continuity meant to confer divine legitimacy. This interpretation is reasonable, widely accepted, and supported by comparative analysis of how other ancient cultures constructed origin myths. The Romans traced their ancestry to Aeneas, a Trojan hero, to legitimize their rule over the Mediterranean. The Japanese emperors claimed descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu, linking their authority to divine origin. Invented genealogies are a common feature of kingship ideologies. The Sumerian king list, in this view, is simply another example of the genre, but this interpretation struggles with certain details. First, the specificity. Propaganda does not require precision. If the goal was simply to claim ancient origins, the list could have been vague. Long ago, before memory, the gods established kingship in the land. Instead, the list names 8 specific kings, assigns them to 5 specific cities, records their reign lengths with mathematical precision, and totals the years. This is not vague mythologizing. This is documentation. The scribes who compiled the list treated it as data, numbering the kings, counting the years, cross-referencing multiple manuscript traditions to ensure consistency. Second, the inclusion of the flood. If the purpose was to legitimize current rulers, by linking them to an ancient past, the flood creates a problem. It interrupts the continuity. It forces the text to explain how kingship resumed after catastrophe. A propaganda document seeking to assert unbroken legitimacy would omit the flood entirely and claim direct descent from the first king, Alulim of Eridu, to the present dynasty. But the king list does not do this. It includes the flood, explicitly marking it as a rupture, and then insists that kingship was restored despite the interruption. This suggests that the flood was not an optional narrative element that could be included or excluded based on political convenience. It was a fixed part of the tradition, something the scribes could not omit because their audience knew it had happened. The flood was not invented to serve the king list. The king list had to account for the flood because it was already part of collective memory. Third, the archaeological confirmation of post-flood kings. Enmebaragesi is real. Gilgamesh may be based on a real figure. Mesnepadar of Ur is confirmed by inscriptions. Once the list reaches the early dynastic period, it aligns increasingly with archaeological and textual evidence. This is not the pattern of pure myth. Myths do not suddenly transition into reliable history at an arbitrary point, but the king list does, which suggests that it is not pure myth. It is a composite, mythological or symbolic elements in the antediluvian section, transitioning to historical record in the post-flood section. Where does the transition occur? Mainstream scholarship assumes it happens somewhere around Enmebaragesi, making him the first reliable entry and everything before him symbolic. But this assumption is convenient rather than proven. If Enmebaragesi is historical, why not his father, Iltasadum? Why not Etana, whose myth is independently attested? Why not Jushur, the first post-flood king? The orthodox answer is that we lack archaeological confirmation for the earlier figures. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The early dynastic period is poorly preserved, and many cities have been incompletely excavated or destroyed by later occupation. The fact that we have not found inscriptions naming Jushur or Etana does not mean they did not exist. It means we have not found them yet. Fourth, the alignment with flood narratives. The king list's flood is not an isolated claim. It appears in the Eridu Genesis, the Atra-Hasis epic, the Gilgamesh epic, Berosus's Babyloniaca, and even in the biblical Genesis account, which was likely influenced by Mesopotamian traditions during the Babylonian exile. Multiple independent sources across different languages and time periods describe a catastrophic flood and a survivor who preserved humanity. This is not the pattern of a single propagandistic invention. It is the pattern of a deeply rooted tradition, maintained across centuries because it was considered factually true. Fifth, the procedural details in the flood narratives. The instructions for building the vessel are specific: coat it with bitumen, seal the seams, construct it with specific dimensions. The survival techniques are practical: release birds to test for land, wait for the raven not to return, offer sacrifices upon disembarkation. These are not the kinds of details that arise from pure myth-making. They are the kinds of details that come from someone who actually built a waterproof vessel, actually survived a prolonged inundation, actually needed to determine when it was safe to leave. Myths can include realistic details borrowed from common experience, but the flood narratives go beyond this. They describe a scenario: surviving a weeks-long flood in a sealed vessel with livestock that is so specific and unusual that it is difficult to imagine it arising purely from imagination. It is more plausible that someone, at some point in the tradition, actually did these things, and the memory was preserved even as it was mythologized. Mainstream scholarship has no good answer for this combination of factors. The standard explanations, political propaganda, symbolic myth, corrupted oral tradition, do not account for the specificity, the consistency, the archaeological alignment, or the procedural realism. They assumed that ancient people could not distinguish between history and myth, that they freely invented pasts without regard for truth. But the Sumerians were meticulous record keepers. Their administrative tablets are precise, their legal codes detailed, their astronomical observations accurate. These are not people who casually blurred fact and fiction, which raises the possibility that the King List is not propaganda. It is an archive, a flawed, mythologized, partially corrupted archive, but an archive nonetheless. An attempt to preserve the memory of what came before, including the catastrophic rupture of the flood and the survival of a bloodline that carried kingship into the New World. If this interpretation is correct, then the Sumerians were not inventing legitimacy, they were documenting inheritance, and the bloodline they claimed to descend from was not a symbolic construct. It was a family, a lineage, a genealogy that began before the flood and continued after, connecting the old world to the new through the survival of a single man and his descendants. If the tablets speak true, suppose for a moment that the Sumerian king list is not propaganda. Suppose it is an imperfect but genuine attempt to preserve historical memory. Suppose the flood was real, a catastrophic inundation around 2900 BC that destroyed the cities of Kish and Shrupuk, traumatized the survivors, and was remembered as a world-ending event. Suppose the Ziusudra was real, a king or priest who received a warning, built a vessel, survived the waters, and became the ancestor of the post-flood dynasties. Suppose the genealogies are distorted but not fabricated, compressed by oral tradition but rooted in actual family lines. If these suppositions are true, the implications reshape our understanding of early civilization. First, it means that the Sumerians were not the inventors of civilization, they were its restorers. The achievements of the early dynastic period, writing, mathematics, architecture, astronomy, law, did not arise spontaneously from agricultural surplus and social complexity. They were recovered from pre-flood knowledge, transmitted by survivors who carried the memory of how the old world had functioned. This would explain the apparent suddenness of Sumerian civilization's emergence. Around 3200 BC, cuneiform appears, fully formed as an administrative system. Within a few centuries, cities expand, monumental temples are constructed, and long-distance trade networks are established. The conventional explanation is gradual evolution, each generation building on the last. But gradual evolution does not easily account for the rapid crystallization of complex systems. If those systems were not invented, but remembered, reconstructed from pre-flood knowledge preserved orally or in perishable forms, then the speed of development makes more sense. Second, it means that the Mesopotamian flood tradition is not borrowed from the biblical account. It is the source. Genesis was written during or after the Babylonian exile, when Jewish scribes were exposed to Mesopotamian culture and adapted its stories to monotheistic theology. The Noah narrative is a Hebrew reinterpretation of Ziusudra, Atra-Hasis, and Utnapishtim, preserving the core while removing the polytheistic context. If the Mesopotamian version is historically grounded, then the biblical version is a theological retelling of real events, not pure legend. Third, it means that the concept of a pre-flood, advanced civilization is not baseless speculation. It has documentary support from the people who lived closest to the event. The Sumerians claimed that their knowledge came from before the flood. They claimed that kingship descended from heaven after the catastrophe. They claimed that the post-flood world was a restoration, not a creation, and they preserved these claims in multiple independent sources across centuries. Mainstream archaeology has not found material evidence of a pre-flood civilization comparable to Sumer, but the absence is not conclusive. If the pre-flood cities were built in the same river valleys as the Sumerian cities, And if they were destroyed by a catastrophic flood around 2900 BC, their remains would be buried under meters of silt and later occupation. Deep excavation is expensive, technically difficult, and often impossible at sites where modern cities have been built over ancient ruins. The absence of evidence may simply reflect the limitations of what has been explored. Fourth, it means that the genealogy recorded in the king list is the oldest known attempt to document human ancestry. If Emabaragesi is historical, and if his ancestors listed in the king list have any basis in reality, then the genealogy stretches back through the early dynastic period across the flood to the antediluvian kings of Eridu, Bad Tabira, and Shuruppak. This would make the king list not just a political document, but the world's first genealogical record, an attempt to preserve family memory across a catastrophe that nearly obliterated it. Fifth, it means that the bloodline the Sumerians claimed to preserve was real, not symbolic, not metaphorical, an actual family line descending from pre-flood rulers through Ziusudra to the post-flood kings of Kish. The survival of this bloodline was not guaranteed. It required someone to be warned, someone to act, someone to endure the waters and emerge to rebuild. And the Sumerians believed, across all their sources, that this someone was Ziusudra, king, priest, survivor, ancestor. These implications are not proof. They are consequences of taking the Sumerian sources at face value, treating them as historical testimony rather than mythological invention. Modern scholarship is reluctant to do this, trained to approach ancient texts with skepticism, to assume that myth is more common than history, to privilege material evidence over documentary claims. This skepticism is often warranted. Ancient texts are full of exaggeration, distortion, and ideological bias. But skepticism can also blind. If every ancient claim is dismissed as myth, then no ancient testimony can ever be accepted, and history becomes impossible to reconstruct. The Sumerians wrote down their traditions because they believed them. They preserved them across centuries because they considered them important. They aligned them with archaeological realities like the flood strata at Kish and Shuruppak because they believed the events had actually occurred in those places. To dismiss all of this as political propaganda or mythological invention is to assume that the Sumerians were either liars or fools. But they were neither. They were careful scribes, meticulous administrators, skilled astronomers, and thoughtful theologians. When they claimed that kingship descended from heaven after the flood, they were making a statement about their own origins, their own identity, and their own place in the cosmic order. Whether that statement was true is a question the tablets cannot definitively answer, but they insist, over and over, in text after text, that a bloodline was preserved, that the flood was survived, that kingship resumed, that what came after was connected by blood to what came before. And if they were right, then the history we thought we knew is incomplete. The story of civilization's origin does not begin with the Sumerians. It begins before them, in a world that drowned, leaving only a few to remember. The question the clay holds. The World Blundell Prism is still there, in the Ishmolean Museum, Oxford, catalogue number WB444. You could visit it if you wanted. Stand before the glass case. Look at the four-sided clay column with its meticulous cuneiform script. Feel the weight of nearly 4,000 years pressing through the display. The scribe who shaped it did not know you would be reading these words, did not know that scholars would decipher cuneiform, translate Sumerian, reconstruct kingship sequences, excavate flood strata, did not know that the names pressed into the clay, Alulim, Ziusudra, Jushur, Enmebaragesi, would survive into an age when clay tablets themselves are museum curiosities rather than administrative tools. But the scribe knew something you do not. The scribe knew why the list mattered, knew why the antediluvian kings had to be recorded even though their reign lengths were impossible, knew why the flood had to be mentioned even though it interrupted the continuity, knew why the genealogies had to be preserved, even though dynasties rose and fell, cities were conquered, and empires crumbled. The scribe knew because the tradition was alive, because the memory was still fresh enough, still urgent enough, that documenting it was an act of preservation, not invention. Because the bloodline the list traced was not a metaphor but a claim, we are the heirs of those who came before. We survived the catastrophe, we carried the knowledge, we rebuilt the world. The question the clay holds is whether that claim is true. Not symbolically true, not mythologically true, historically true. Did a catastrophic flood destroy the heartland of early Mesopotamia around 2900 BCE? The archaeology says yes. Flood strata at Kish, Shuruppak and Ur confirm massive inundations. The dates align with the transition from the Jemdet-Nasser period to early dynastic I, precisely when the king list places the flood. Did someone survive and preserve the memory? The texts say yes. Multiple independent sources, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Greek, name the survivor, describe his actions, and connect him to pre-flood kingship. The consistency across linguistic and cultural boundaries suggests a deeply rooted tradition, not isolated invention. Did the post-flood dynasties descend from the survivor? The genealogies say yes. The king list insists on continuity. Enmebaragesi, confirmed by archaeology, sits within a genealogy that stretches back across the flood. His existence proves that some of the list is historical. The question is, how much? You have heard the evidence. You have seen the flood strata, the inscriptions, the tablets, the genealogies. You have followed the thread from Eridu to Shuruppak, from Ziusudra to Enmebaragesi, from the antediluvian world to the early dynastic dynasties. You have heard the mainstream interpretation, myth, propaganda, symbolic chronology, and you have heard the alternative, memory, archive, preserved bloodline. The tablets do not force a conclusion, they offer a possibility, that the Sumerians were telling the truth as they understood it, that the flood was real, that the survivor was real, that the bloodline was preserved. Whether you believe that possibility depends on what you think is more likely, that a highly literate, meticulously organised, astronomically sophisticated civilization would fabricate an elaborate multi-source tradition about a flood and a survivor purely for political propaganda, or that they would remember, imperfectly but genuinely, a catastrophe that reshaped their world and a family that endured it. The question remains open. The evidence is incomplete. The texts are fragmentary. The archaeology is ambiguous. But the claim is clear. A bloodline was preserved after the Great Flood, not because the gods required it, not because fate demanded it, but because one man listened, acted, survived, and passed the memory to his children. And those children became kings, and those kings built cities, and those cities inscribed tablets. And those tablets, pressed into clay and baked hard by fire, outlasted empires, religions, languages and civilizations, carrying a single message across millennia. We remember, we survived, we are the heirs. The well-Blundell prism holds that message still. The cuneiform signs are silent, but the claim is loud. The names are ancient, but the genealogy is unbroken. The flood was long ago, but the bloodline persists. Whether in text or in truth, the Sumerians believed they descended from those who came before the waters. They believed kingship was not invented, but inherited. They believed that civilization was restored, not created. And they wrote it down, not for themselves, for you, for anyone who would come after, who would wonder how the world began, where humanity came from, and whether the old stories hold more than metaphor. The clay cannot answer those questions definitively, but it asks them insistently, pressed into permanence by a scribe who believed the bloodline mattered enough to document, the flood mattered enough to record, and the genealogy mattered enough to preserve. Wherever you are, as the night deepens and the questions linger, consider this: the Sumerians were the first civilization to write. And the first thing they wrote, after learning to record grain and livestock, was a list of kings. Not just the kings they knew, the kings who came before, the kings who ruled before the flood, the kings whose names had been carried across the waters by someone who survived. That survivor had a name, Ziusudra. He had a city, Shurupak. He had descendants, and those descendants, the Sumerians claimed, were them. If that claim is even partially true, then every achievement of Sumer, every temple, every tablet, every law, every star chart, was built not on innovation, but on restoration, on knowledge that was remembered, on wisdom that was inherited, on a bloodline that endured the flood and carried the old world into the new. The question the clay holds is whether that inheritance was real. You decide.